You're listening to the Virtue Podcast, brought to you by the Great Hearts Institute. Good conversations around the great conversation. Welcome back. I'm Robert Jackson of the Great Hearts Institute. So good to have you with us today. And our guest, Wilfred McClay, Professor McClay from Hillsdale College. Now, I have to say right off the bat, this fella has an illustrious career behind him. He has been working at multiple institutions of higher education. He has served as board member for a variety of organizations, including the Ethics and Public Policy Center, the Trinity Forum. He leads the Philadelphia Society. But not inconsequentially, he's also been a board member at the National Endowment for the Humanities. And as of right now, serves on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission to celebrate our 250th anniversary coming up here soon. Bill, of all that which you've been a part of, what's your favorite? What do you really relish?
Well, I like being part of the Great Hearts Institute, actually.
Oh, that's the right answer, Bill. That's the right answer. So anyhow,
I'm honored to be part of this enterprise. I think this is one, the whole explosion of interest in classical education is one of the really hopeful signs. There are others, but American primary and secondary education, higher education, I think is a tougher nut to crack. We're pretty lost, but there's a lot of hope on this, particularly secondary level. And you guys at Great Hearts are doing a wonderful job. I was hooked when you brought me out. Well, actually, it wasn't you; it was your predecessor, but brought me out to Scottsdale to speak at a commencement, and I was just bowled over. It was incredulous at not just the outpouring of talent, but the spirit of the room there was something I'll never forget. So
well, that's what we plan on continuing, and with your good help, we plan on promoting classical education across this country.
Yeah, that's great.
I've asked Professor McClay to join us today to talk about a publication that's receiving wide acclaim, Land of Hope, an American history that was penned a few years ago, but has now been joined by a young reader's edition, not to mention a teacher's handbook and other associated materials. So we're going to talk about this text. And Bill, it looks like you've got it there. There we go. Do the blurb.
These are Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Land of Hope Junior, as we affectionately call it. But it's the young reader's edition. It's really designed for middle schoolers. Depending on reading levels, some very bright primary school kids could read it. I also think high schoolers could benefit, those who are not good readers. It is simplified, but without being dumbed down. And that's a real task. I have found this a very difficult but very rewarding project. It came about because so many people liked Land of Hope, the original version, which is one volume, and was really designed for juniors, seniors in high school, maybe college freshmen, sophomores. It ended up finding a readership among grown-ups, among so-called grown-ups, people in their 50s, 60s, baby boomers, others who felt that they somehow had never gotten an education in American history. And they loved it. And we've sold a lot of copies. We're just now beginning to make inroads in the schools. And what we're hoping is that Land of Hope Junior, the young reader's edition, can really catch fire and be a resource for people teaching in middle school and whatever level of educational level they think it might be useful. So that's what that's all about.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the origin of Land of Hope, that first edition. And I'd like to start by quoting you. I'm going to pull a quote here out of the introduction and just have you give me a little explanation. You say the following: "For the human animal, meaning is not a luxury. It's a necessity. Without it, we perish. Historical consciousness is to civilized society what memory is to individual identity. Without memory and without the stories by which our memories are carried forward, we cannot say who or what we are. Without them, our life and thought dissolve into a meaningless, unrelated rush of events. Without them, we cannot do the most human of things. We cannot learn, use language, pass on knowledge, raise children, establish rules of conduct, engage in science, or dwell harmoniously in society. Without them, we cannot govern ourselves. Bill, that's from your introduction in the first edition of Land of Hope. It sounds like the telling of history and the recounting of our past is essential to being human. What prompted you
Yes.
to write this book?
Well, the sense that yes, we are storytelling creatures. We are historians of our own lives. If we attempt to make sense of our lives instead of living them just as one thing after another, without any end, without any purpose, without any trajectory, without any arc, without any directionality, without any meaning. And we do crave meaning. Meaning is essential. You know, we're not for better or worse, we are burdened with a very demanding consciousness that is not content to simply live a sensate life, just floating on the surface of things. We need the sustenance of deeper meanings, of a sense of what our lives are for, what we are on this earth to do, what's expected of us, what's hoped for from us. So yeah, history is part of that, and I think it's and we have a special civilization in the West. It's not based on race or it does have something to do with religion, but it's not based on sort of ethnic, blood in the soil sorts of factors. It's based on a certain way of thinking, a certain combination of ideas and of approaches to ideas that I would oversimplify a little bit by referring to the dichotomy of Athens and Jerusalem, that the rationalism that we associate with ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Jerusalem, the biblical tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Abrahamic tradition, that tradition of stories, which have been the template for much of our civilization. The Exodus story, for example, is a parable of so many things about our understanding of freedom, of what it means to be free. So I think both of those things are important to be aware of, both of those aspects of our heritage. And they're somewhat in conflict with one another. That's one of the interesting things about the West. The West is not simple. The West has a very secular side to it. The West also has a very religious side to it. They both are essential, I would say. Both. There's some of us who favor one side over the other somewhat, but I think they both are in their tension is essential.
I appreciate that, because I think the tension is important. But there were some tensions that prompted you to even go about writing this text. I mean, you're a historian, so tell us a bit about that backstory, if you will.
Yeah. That's a good. You know, I am a professional historian by training. Professional historians are, one of my graduate advisors, whose name I won't mention, but he said, I write for only 3 or 4 people. And he's a very distinguished guy, but a colonial historian, I'll tell you that much. And he wrote highly technical, long articles in scholarly journals. That was his métier. I always had reservations about that. I thought that a history of the United States ought to be in some way the possession of the people, and not of some little band of self-proclaimed experts. So that meant that we should have some awareness of our larger audience and some willingness to write for them, to write in a way that's accessible to them, that will nourish their sense of belonging to this nation, to this culture. And so that thought has always nagged at me. I never could accept the writing for three people part. And then through my career, I've tried to write for general interest publications, but I've really been fairly rarefied. I haven't written things in the National Enquirer, for example. I've never done that. I don't even aspire to it. But but I've written a little bit for newspapers and that kind of thing. And what happened? That the thing you're really referring to here, I suspect, is that in 2014, the College Board, which is the organization that administers advanced placement testing, changed their standards for the AP US History course, and in ways that a number of us found shocking. The omission of the founders of the great figures of American history, the omission or downplaying of the Constitutional Convention, the constitutional debates, the ratification debates, Federalist Papers, and so on. A number of ways that they ignored things that we really think are important. So I drafted a letter, and a number of people, I think about 200 people signed it, to the College Board, imploring them not to make these changes permanent. And they backtracked a certain amount, but the textbook publishers had already picked up these changes and were reflected in the new textbooks. So people started saying, well, yeah, I think we need a new textbook. And they would come to me and say, we need a new textbook. And I would say, I agree. I hope you find somebody to do it. Because I did not want to. I knew what they were getting at. I didn't want to be the one to do it. And maybe it's worth saying a word or two about that, because I think it's writing for the public is a dangerous thing to your professional standing. Writing a textbook, it can be deadly, so I didn't. And writing a textbook that went against the grain, which I knew I would have to do, because the title of the book alone tells you that this is not a book that sees American history as an uninterrupted sort of dirge of deplorable acts by deplorable people, an endless parade of Confederate flags and Indian removal and all of the things that admittedly scandalous things in our history, that it's not all of our history. And that I saw a theme of hope, of human hope, in all of its different manifestations running through our history, and that spiritual principle was something that needed to be emphasized. So I reluctantly agreed to do the book. Once I got into it, you know how you convince yourself that something you have to do is the most important thing that ever. But I really did become convinced of how important this was, and that there was nothing out there, because I was reading all the other textbooks and realizing that the astonishing void that there was. It's not that all these textbooks are bad. Some of them are very good. I don't know who they're written for. I really don't. I mean, one of the things I did not have to do is go through all sorts of committees and stakeholders and vettings of my manuscript to make sure that I was fair to every conceivable protest group. There was none of that. The publisher hardly looked at it at all. He just had complete trust in me. So that's how it happened. I was sort of hornswoggled into doing this, and by the time it was done, I was very glad I had done it. And I'll tell you the truth: the blowback from the profession has not been anything like what I expected. I was braced for the worst. I've had very few negative reviews, and those have been, if I may say, completely ineffectual. Obviously, ideologically based, not even worth responding to. Um, by and large, there's been, I think, silence. Um, but there's so little that I think one can really find fault in, and yet it's so different from anything out there, because what I try to do, it's very simple when you state it this way. I try to take cognizance of all the things about American history and American life that are negative in character, that represent flaws, that represent sins, acknowledge them, and then try to place them in a proper perspective. And that last part is what's key, because you can't, I think we have to be honest about American history. And I think part of the honesty means that we don't neglect the faults, the flaws. But part of the honesty is, too, that we don't neglect the magnificence of this kind of history. The extraordinary people who have made us what we are, the sacrifices of those people, on and on and on. It's equally, and I think maybe even more grievous mistake to neglect that. And so that's what I think a balanced history of the United States should be about. And I think we were getting to a point where saying anything nice about our history was regarded as a kind of crime against the professionalism of historical discipline. That's just silly.
Well, it's interesting. Your description of the profession, again, with moderation, is that in many ways it had lost sight of the general audience. And you describe yourself as one who wanted to author, from the beginning of your career, wanted to author works that would be accessible so as to provide the people, people, right, with an accessible, understandable history. That seems noble enough. Ironically, the people's history, as the title has it, is not always the type that you're describing, where there is a hopeful, ideal-based, and aspirational purpose, but you're trying to bring the hope back. So to speak.
That's a great point. And the people's history is sort of not really written for the people. It's written for a certain. Now, let me say this. We're talking about Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, and the best-selling textbook, and it is a good read, which is something the other textbooks are not. I wanted to be a good read too. I mean, I set out to be a good read and to do some of what Howard Zinn does, but to do it more responsibly. And Howard Zinn, he turns everything into a melodrama of black hats and white hats. And you can see why young people, there's this famous scene in the movie Good Will Hunting where the Matt Damon character says, "Oh, you ought to read Howard Zinn," who actually turns out in real life was Matt Damon's neighbor, interestingly. But he'll blow your mind. I'm not quoting this exactly, but it's you can see it having an appeal to adolescents, particularly rebellious adolescents. But it's not good history. No respectable historian will vouch for that, and not one. And by the way, if I may just mention, there are no respectable historians I know of. I mean, first-rate historians who will support the 1619 project that's gotten so much attention. They're discreetly silent about it because they know they'll have their heads chopped off if they, figuratively speaking, on Twitter, if they dare to criticize it. But they know it's bad history.
It's remarkable, Bill, that to be hopeful, to set forth ideals of a nation, to tell the story eyes wide open, but with a confidence that there's something there that we can in fact hold dear, that we can love. That telling of the story is controversial, is countercultural.
No, it is. And look, the hardest thing, I've said this again and again, the hardest thing about writing this book was deciding to do it,
Hmm.
making myself commit myself to doing it, because I had this sense, and I'd internalized it in 30 plus years of the discipline, that there's a certain taboo against being too positive about American history, um, and then there are those who are so positive that they go crazy, and they don't give enough attention to the negatives, to the shameful things in our history, and to the hypocrisy even of some of our greatest men, Thomas Jefferson, for example.
Yep.
And one of the things I try to get across, and I think I've done a pretty good job, because people have praised me for this, but is to communicate to the reader that heroes can have flaws. We can view someone as a hero who is deeply flawed by our standards. And in fact, there are no other kinds of heroes in the real world. Comic books, maybe, but not in the real world. If you want to live in the real world, you need to deal with the fact that heroes are imperfect people.
We seem to have lost that capacity, and
yes.
I'm certainly hopeful that your history and your subsequent writings, your previous and subsequent writings that will follow, will speak to this, because it does seem as though this way of carefully parsing the past, so as to understand that admixture, right? As Solzhenitsyn famously said, right? The line between good and evil, right, goes right down the center of every human heart. How can we recover that, right? And part of it will be the telling of history. I'd like to ask you, because we've given given Zen a slap, as it were, metaphorically, but where are some of the models or exemplars of history that we can read, who are willing to tell the whole truth, right? The whole truth.
Well, and the whole truth. Look, I think I want to add, and this is not meant to sound a relativistic note, but the whole truth as they see it.
Right.
We're inevitably
limited,
bound up in the concerns of our times. Just to give an easy example, 100 years ago, historians of the ancient world, of ancient Greece and Rome, gave very little attention to women, and to the household, and there's some, but not a lot. And now, of course, it's much more front and center, particularly among scholars, and that is a great thing. It reflects the times that we're living in, reflects the fact that we're asking different questions of the past. I think what we know about the past is always in part a function of what questions we want to direct to the past and to the evidence that we have available to us. But models, I think there are models galore, and they don't only come from modern times. I think this is another way that the study of history in graduate schools distorts people's thinking, because I remember, this is actually the same professor I quoted before, who wrote for 3 people. I did a field with this guy, and as a graduate student, which means you read a huge bibliography, and then you have an oral exam, or a written exam, and then an oral exam with him. He didn't even particularly like to teach classes. He just wanted you to read the books and then be examined. But he was very good. He was very good. I don't fault him in all. But so I had a huge bibliography. I mean, I think there were 500 or 600 books on it. And this is one of 4 fields at Hopkins, Johns Hopkins. But he had certain books, and one was, again, this won't mean anything to your audience. So actually, I won't even name it, but that was a fairly recent book, maybe from the 1960s. So I was in grad school in the 1980s, so that's not that remote. And he put in parentheses, for antiquarian purposes only. That captures so much about graduate education, that it is, and it's not just that we don't read Thucydides or Livy.
Mm-hmm.
It's that we don't read the people 15 minutes ago. Everything is this, and what a funny thing for history.
Yeah, of all things.
Of all things, history would be trendy and fashionable, and so I think in my world, in my universe, if I were king, I would insist that the graduate students read all the old, not just Thucydides, but Herodotus. Read the father of history. Read the great Greco-Roman historians. Read Guicciardini and read people all the way up into the modern period, but all in the modern period, Burckhardt and a lot of European historians.
Sure.
I think Americanists don't get that stuff. They might read Marx. That's about it. Who is
the Economist? The Economist.
And I think they should read Marx. I think Marx is important,
of course.
On into the 20th century. I think Richard Hofstadter, especially the later Richard Hofstadter, is a great exemplar. He has a book called The Progressive Historian, so I think is one of the real masterpieces of modern historical writing. Henry Adams.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
The great-grandson of John Adams, our second president, and John Quincy Adams, who was his grandfather. Henry Adams is a brilliant historian. He wrote a history of the United States in the Jefferson and Madison administrations, and it's in some ways a defense of the Adams family's sort of approach to politics. But it's very well done. It's history in the grand manner, and nobody reads it. Nobody reads it.
Yeah.
Gary Wills wrote a book about it, and complained nobody reads it, and nobody read Gary Wills's book. So it's really hard to get people interested in old history but older history, it's like all old books. And C.S. Lewis tells us that we must read old books. I saw something the other day where he said that there's some books that Pilgrim's Progress, I think he said he read 30 times. And you don't want to do that with every book. I wouldn't read Catcher in the Rye 30 times. Once is enough. But the ones that the friends that thou hast, as Polonius said, grab them to thy soul with hoops of steel. Those are the books you do want to read and reread and reread.
That's right.
Just as the Mozart you want to listen to again and again and again. And so
That's
on.
right. That's right.
But historians have not produced a lot of books. Like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Now, there's a great work of history. It's probably all wrong. I certainly object to its negative view of Christianity myself, but it's a masterful example of how one constructs a historical account and how it is literarily distinguished, but also from an argumentative standpoint, powerful.
It's a work of art. It's a work of art, is it not?
Thank you. Thank you.
And Bill, let's go back to your work and your work of art, which we hope, of course, is going to have a great readership, because I'd really like to hear from you, and I think our audience would want to hear which of the chapters, you've got them broken up, obviously, according to a chronology as you tell the American story, which of your chapters and or time periods was most enjoyable, your favorite to write?
Oh, yeah. There's a I can't remember this. I think it's chapter 7. Called The Culture of Democracy.
Yep.
The Culture of Democracy. I think that's my favorite. That because that's such a moment, the whole Jacksonian era, but the cultural aspect of it, and not the politics, which are not really all that interesting. But what was happening culturally. This is an era of explosion of reform energies, explosion of literature and the arts. Tocqueville, whom I revere, Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French observer of America, he predicted, America was never going to do much of anything in the arts. This is writing in 1835, 1840. Well, within 10 years, America was proving him wrong. We have 1850, The Scarlet Letter is published, and then and that's the first great American novel that the whole world has to read. And then you have Melville, and you have more Hawthorne, and you have Emerson, who actually goes back to the 1830s. I mean,
30s. Yeah,
1830, 37, 38. Yeah, and then you Thoreau, Walden, which is a masterpiece. And Whitman, who kind of invented a certain kind of poetry that's very American and brought this. I mean, things like Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, the feel, the freedom of the anonymity of the big city. There's so much in that period of the classic American literature of the mid-19th century that I still think is the heart of of what America has given the world.
It just took a little time to gestate the American culture, that democratic impulse.
Not very long when you think about it.
That's right. Not in the scheme of things.
Yep. Yes. So
tell me,
who in the world reads an American book? It didn't take very long to say, well, a lot of people read American books. And you know, you went into the 20th century. You have, I mean, I've kind of waned in my enthusiasm for Hemingway and Fitzgerald, although not Willa Cather. I think she's really great. And so much that's been transformative of modern literature in the world has come out of America. So Coco was wrong about that. What's interesting in that chapter, I'm sorry I'm going on about this, but this is my problem with me, but is Whitman really raises the question of whether it's possible to have a thoroughly democratic art form that also is excellent, that obeys the canons of excellence and responds to those canons. And that's a really interesting question. I think that's still with us.
I think that's right.
I would say that one of the great American achievements, people talk about jazz in music, and I'm with them on that. I think an even greater achievement is American popular song between roughly 1915, 1920, and let's say the middle of the 1960s, you know, up to, let's say, at the Beatles or rock and roll. I've listened to rock and roll all my life. You know, Bob Seger, you know, who comes from this part of the country. You know, I think highly of rock and roll, but American popular song, Cole Porter, Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern. These are people are absolute giants, and they produced a something unexcelled. Its day will come that American popular song will be seen as the leader of democracy.
I love it. I love it, Bill. And I'm not going to give a spoiler here, but you and I have sat down at the piano, you at the piano, and with a songbook, and had ourselves a little thrill there as we
do it in Phoenix. If you come,
I plan on it.
Yeah, well, I'll tell the people listening to this, all 7 of them. If you come to Phoenix, we will put on a performance for you that will knock your sandals off.
Guaranteed. Last question for you, Bill. I really want to ask you, as the author, who of course hopes that Land of Hope will leave a legacy of some sort, what you want that to be. What are you hoping your readers will take from it?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, I want them to take heart that that the civilization they live in is, first of all, a civilization. I think we've lost our way in a lot of things. I think we have lost our way many times in American history. That's one of the comforting things about our past is it's we've bumbled and made mistakes so many times, and yet come through. And we have had, you know, another chapter I like very much is the chapter in World War II, which is called The Finest Hour, which I stole from Churchill, of course, but that phrase. We do manage somehow and I won't say I'm confident, because the American experiment is a white knuckle thing. We're never out of the woods. There's always challenges. It's always seeming to go to hell in a handbasket. But I want to quote a friend of mine, Harry Ballin, who's a New York attorney and law school dean and just a brilliant man, said to me right after I met him, he said, I think that if young people grow up thinking that they live under an unjust regime, it affects their souls. And, I had never thought of it that way. It's not a particularly original insight, but there was something about the way Harry said it that I thought, yes, oh my God, that's so true. The Howard Zinn version of American history, it's damaging to the souls of our young people. That doesn't mean that we need to feed them as fairy tales that will tell them everything is nice and it's a wonderful day in the neighborhood. Will you be my neighbor? It's not to say that. And I like Mr. Rogers too, by the way. But it's not to give a saccharine version. But but they do live under, and even now, when a lot of people are very disgusted, they're either disgusted with the previous presidential administration or the current one. And you could probably get a 75 to 80% consensus that we're going to hell in a handbasket. It just would be a different hell, different handbasket. But I think that's not unusual for us as a country, and that it's part of what goes with being a democracy that has self-corrective mechanisms that often are very hard to live with. It's like having a rolfing of your national soul. But that's what I would like the people to take away, is that you feel confident that they are part of a worthy, and one of the most exciting enterprises in human history. I would go that far. That what this country has meant, what it has done, has beginning with 1776. 1776, the first government in human history to proclaim as a founding principle the view that all men are created equal, all humans are created equal, endowed by their creator, not by government, but by their creator, with certain inalienable rights. That the dignity of each individual person and rights of that person are part of the foundational software of this country. Have we lived up to that in every instance? Of course not. We haven't. And then when I chuckle, I do not mean that I take lightly the ways we have failed to live up. But we have steadily progressed. We've steadily progressed. And I could talk more about how damaging to the souls of young, I think, the 1619 Project is. But I think what I tried to do is to write a book that was not a point counterpoint. This is what Howard Zinn says, and this is why it's wrong. I didn't do that at all. I tried to write as if Howard Zinn didn't exist, and give people an alternative way of understanding the past, and a way of understanding it that I think is in substantial continuity with the way that we have in the past.
I think it's a beautiful book, Bill, and I think what's beneath the cover is inspiring. I believe that you're going to bring a generation around to understanding that we can look carefully at history with our eyes wide open, recognizing the flawed, the crooked timber, right? The flaws of humanity, the flaws of society, and at the same time continue to aspire to meet our ideals, to reach higher. So I want to thank you, Professor McClay, on behalf of my audience, for spending a little time with us and taking a closer look.
Thank you, Rob. And I will hope this is volume 1. I think at this point you probably have to get it from Amazon or Barnes and Noble or one of those. It's just out, and I don't know whether we'll get these in bookstores. Barnes and Noble was great, by the way, with the first line. We were in every Barnes and Noble in the country. It was amazing.
Well, we'll do our best in the show notes to make sure that folks know where to get it and some links so that they can if they're interested.
And if they're interested in bulk copies, the publisher, just have them write to me at my Hillsdale College address.
Will do. All right. There you heard it, folks.
I answer everything I can.
Excellent. Excellent. And we've got you coming out next February to the National Symposium for Classical Education. So join us, folks, in Phoenix, February 22nd to 24th.
Yes, please
with
do.
Professor Wilfred McClay. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Rob.
Registration for the 2023 National Symposium for Classical Education is now open. Join us February 22nd through the 24th in Phoenix, Arizona for 3 days of unsurpassed scholarship, professional workshops, and networking opportunities. For more information, visit www.greathearts.institute. Working together to renew the tradition.